Hey there, how's it going? So today is September 29th, 2017. Obviously, I'm not in Alaska. The town of Ukiah is out there. This is the area that I'm from, hiking along in Low Gap Park. However, a week ago, I was in Alaska. I was in Healy, Alaska, living there for a month while I was working in nearby Denali National Park, about 10 miles away. Some of you who know the Chris McCandless story may know that Healy is where Chris McCandless got dropped off at the end of April 1992, and I will be going back to that time period in just a minute. First, I wanted to preface this by explaining why I was in Alaska just a week ago. So I'm a travel vlogger. I travel around the world making travel videos of my various adventures and experiences. I was in Europe earlier in the summer, in Eastern Europe, down into the Balkans, Greece, Italy, Ireland, Scandinavia, and decided I wanted to go back to Alaska. Go back to Alaska because I lived there from 1990 to 1992 and worked in Denali National Park the summers of 91, 92, and 95. So I decided to go back there at the end of the summer to revisit and to make some extra cash for winter travels. And I ended up getting a job dishwashing in one of the restaurants at the edge of the park where most of the restaurants are. And I ended up living in Healy. I didn't expect to live there. I thought that I was going to live where I lived before, which was closer to where the restaurants and hotels are, but they had moved the employee housing up to Healy. Now in Healy, in front of the 49th State Brewery, is the bus, the Into the Wild bus that was used in the movie Into the Wild about the Chris McCandless story. Not the same bus that Chris McCandless himself actually lived and ultimately died in, but the bus, a replica, a very similar replica that was used in the movie. So you can go visit that bus, go inside it. It's very interesting. There are photos and entries from his journal in there talking about the whole story of how Chris ended up there and all the events that transpired in the course of his living out there in the wilderness in Alaska. Speaking of living in the wilderness, I bet he would have appreciated some turkeys, easy hunting. And so I made a video about that bus, the one that was used in the movie, and told more of the Chris McCandless story, and also mentioned a bit about my own story as far as how it interrelates with Chris McCandless's, but I was mostly focused on his story in that video. So I thought that I would tell in this video the story of my own adventurous experience of hitchhiking to Alaska just a week after Chris McCandless in the spring of 1992. So very quickly, how I ended up in Alaska to begin with was that I was looking through a book of colleges when I was going to a community college here in California that is right north of this town here, Mendocino Community College, and I was considering what four-year university I was going to go to after that. And so I had a book of universities around the nation, and I was looking through it and came across the section for Alaska. I hadn't even considered that there were universities in Alaska, and I was intrigued and decided to apply at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, which was actually the only university that I applied for. 9 months later or so, after various things had transpired, including my traveling to Europe for the summer, I came back from my European adventures and didn't know what I was doing, and asked my dad, hey, do you know if I got into that university in Alaska that I applied to? And so he checked, and sure enough I had. And so a week later, then I was on a plane flying to Fairbanks. I spent the year at school in Fairbanks, worked in Denali National Park for that summer, and then moved with a friend down to Juneau on the Alaskan Panhandle and spent another year at university there. I had another job in Denali National Park lined up for that summer, the summer of 1992, and so I took off, and I am a hitchhiker by nature anyways. I actually started hitchhiking when I was a kid up our dirt road where I lived in the town of Willits, just north of here. And I'd done a lot of hitchhiking in Europe. And so I took a ferry from Juneau up to Haines on the Alaskan Panhandle, because there is no road that goes directly through Alaska. You have to go from the Panhandle into Canada and then back into Alaska. And so, yes, I was already in Alaska, but I did actually hitchhike to Alaska because I went from Alaska into Canada, up through the Yukon, and then back into the main part of Alaska. I don't remember if I had a tent because it took several days. I remember sleeping out several times, once somewhere near Whitehorse in the Yukon, and it was very cold because it was early April. I forget exactly the date, but Chris McCandless was hiking out into the wilderness on like April 29th and April 30th, and I left Juneau sometime in early May, so a week or maybe 2 weeks behind him. So for Alaska, it was still quite cold. It was barely even spring. I slept near some house, I remember, just out in the grass, and my sleeping bag was not quite up to those conditions. I remember being quite cold, but I survived and kept on hitchhiking, entered into Canada, and then I got a ride with a guy who was a B-movie actor. This guy, probably mid-30s or something. I was just 20 years old at the time, and he was driving from Hollywood to New York City, and he decided to take a detour going through Alaska, quite a detour. So he was heading for Anchorage. I was going to Denali National Park, and so I ended up driving with him for several days. I forget exactly, 2-3 days or something. I remember us camping at least one night, maybe there was another one, and I don't exactly remember the route because we went south at one point. We went across the Denali Highway, which is a very interesting, beautiful, very remote highway that connects two of the major highways of Alaska. And then somehow he ended up dropping me off in Wasilla. Wasilla is where Sarah Palin lives, the former governor of Alaska and John McCain's vice presidential running mate. And I remember sleeping out that night. I kind of vaguely remember maybe being in a tent, so maybe I did have a tent. Anyways, one way or another, then I ended up where I was heading, Denali National Park, and started my work there. So at that point then Chris would have been, you know, at that bus and settling in there, hunting in the wilderness and trying to survive. Meanwhile, I was having a much different experience of working 40 hours a week and then going on backpacking trips out into the park on my weekends, doing wilderness exploring, but not in the same way as Chris, obviously. And it was later in that summer that I heard the news that somebody had been found dead somewhere north of the park. Something about a bus, and he'd starved. You know, just got little snippets of the story. Later, several months later, I think it was the winter of 1992-93, then I had a subscription to Outside magazine, and the magazine showed up, and there was an article in it, an article by John Krakauer about the Chris McCandless story. He had first written an article for Outside magazine in which he had done his research about what happened, trying to figure it out, piece the puzzle pieces together. And so it was sometime after he had published that article that he continued his research, I guess, and ended up writing the full-length book about Chris McCandless and his full story. But I was definitely really tripped out when I came across this article in a major magazine talking about this story that I had heard about while I was working up there in Denali National Park, just 40 miles or something away from where Chris McCandless himself was going through his very arduous ordeal. And then later, of course, the movie came out and I saw the movie. And so that pretty much sums up my own experience. And I thought that I would, at the end of this video, just add a few thoughts about his story and what he experienced and his preparedness or lack thereof, what he did to his parents in terms of leaving them, not knowing where he was for 2 years. Now, I know that, you know, I'm not him. I don't know the whole story. There were a lot of factors involved with his family and various dramas and situations going on that caused him to leave and just say, screw all that, I'm getting out of here and getting away from civilization and society and family and all this craziness, and just leave and go somewhere just totally separate from all of that. So I think he was kind of somewhere straddling the line between understandably disturbed and fed up and disgusted by both his own family dynamics and society in general, and just wanting to actually experience himself separate from all that, and, you know, find himself, as they say, and figure out what he really wanted to do in life and what the meaning of life really was. He changed his name from Chris McCandless to Alexander Supertramp. That's kind of a typical thing for someone just wanting to disconnect from their own identity and create a new identity. And so on one hand, I can say, okay, I can see that, I can understand it. It's a possibly healthy thing for someone just to want to separate from their whole life and past and everything in order to find out who they really are. But at the same time, he took it to such an extreme. Not even, you know, a postcard to his family saying, I'm alive, you know, sometime in those 2 years, just writing and saying, sorry I took off, but just, you know, I'm still here, I'm traveling, whatever. Just like a little something for his parents to know and not be worrying for so long what had happened to him. And also when it comes to what he did with hiking out into the wilderness, he just was not prepared at all. He had a very idealistic, ungrounded, disconnected, unrealistic idea of what he was going to be able to do in hiking out into the Alaskan wilderness, one of the most intense, difficult, challenging terrains in the world, and trying to live off the land with just a rifle and a bag of rice. Now, he definitely deserves some credit and some respect for the fact that he actually made it happen, that he actually did survive off the land. He caught various game. He shot that moose, which he had no experience in how to cure the meat, and so he ruined it. But he was finding animals and plants, and he actually managed to live there for 100 days, a little bit more than 100 days, living off the land, which is no easy feat at all. He did, of course, end up ultimately dying there of starvation, in part because of a mistake that might not have actually been his own mistake, with those potato seeds that, according to his book, I read an article exploring this in depth, according to the book that he had of the plants of the area, then those potato seeds were okay to eat. And the book itself may have actually been incorrect, confusing it with a different plant. And so he might have accurately read this book, thinking that these seeds were okay to eat, and then started eating them, and it turned out that they were actually poisonous over time. And so that was one of the main factors that ultimately did him in. Additionally, he hardly knew where he was. He was on the west side of the Teklanika River, which is the river that he had walked through when it was shallow in the spring, and then he tried to walk back over it later in the summer when it was flowing much stronger, and discovered that it was impassable. And so he turned around and hiked back to the bus. Well, if he had known more about the area, he might have known that there was a cable across the river just a half-mile upstream, south of where he was on that side of the river, that he could have taken across the river. Also, if he hadn't known about that, because that's a little bit obscure, if he had simply known that Denali National Park was just south of him, and he could have hiked there in a day or two and gotten to the busy park road where there were shuttle buses for free going out of the park, going back to the main highway, and he could have just caught a shuttle bus back to civilization. He had cash on him. As I understand, he had like $300 that he had set aside because it wasn't a suicide mission. He thought that he would get out of there, and he could have if he had had more knowledge and information of where he was, if he had been more prepared for where he was going and the terrain, the topography, the surroundings, because he could have easily hiked out of there and survived. So for me, then it's a mixed review of, you know, on one hand I can relate to some extent. On the other hand, he was certainly ill-prepared and reckless to a great extent, and insensitive to his family, who was worrying about him for 2 years as he hitchhiked around the country. Anyway, quite a story, and he seems like he was a good guy at heart, just kind of bumbling around, searching for something, searching for some, you know, measure of truth and meaning in life. All right, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for videos coming next from Asia. Take it easy.